Hello, everyone, and welcome to this launch event. My name is Nikiwe Bikicha. Well, Africa, like many parts of the world, forms part of a global information economy where data knows no bounds. However, laws and regulations do, and there are rules regulating the transfer of data across international borders. While in some Africa countries, there are enabling policy and regulatory frameworks that allows for the appropriate use and flow of data, many more have barriers to cross-border data use and transfer, making it more expensive and time-consuming. Now, those countries risk not realizing the full socioeconomic benefits of digital transformation due to low levels of data protection laws and regulations, as well as the slow pace of developing and enacting them in some instances. Now, the slow adoption and enactment of data privacy laws is likely due to a lack of trust in the security of the technology being deployed. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is against this background that the Ouder, NEPAD, and the Vodacom Group, through their partnership, are today launching a policy paper entitled Enabling Policy Frameworks for Digital and Data Services for Expanded Economic Growth and Development, a focus on the SADC region. So today we will hear from a number of speakers and experts who will outline the key findings and recommendations emanating from this particular position paper and explore ways to help pave the way forward on this critical issue by speaking to just some of these questions and certainly much more than that. What are the socioeconomic benefits of the appropriate free flow of data among jurisdictions? Secondly, what are some of the barriers of an enabling regulatory environment for digital and data services? Those are just some of the themes and questions we'll be exploring today. We look forward to your interaction and participation throughout the session today. So if you would like to put any or pose any questions to our speakers, please do so throughout the session and do so as soon as possible so we have enough time to put those questions to them during our roundtable discussion later on. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome now our first speaker of the day, Mr. Stephen Chege. Now, Stephen is the Vodacom Group Chief External Affairs Officer. Over to you, Stephen.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Nikiwe. I would like to welcome you all to the launch of our Digital and Data Services Advocacy paper titled Enabling Policy Frameworks for Digital and Data Services for Expanded Economic Growth and Development, a focus on the SADC region. A special and warm welcome to our esteemed guests, regulators and policymakers from all the markets where we operate, including the DRC, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Lesotho, Mozambique, South Africa, and Tanzania. Thank you all for joining us. Vodacom Group has partnered up with the African Union Development Agency, New Partnerships for Africa's Development, Ouder, NEPAD, to co-host the launch of this paper. This is a key collaboration for our advocacy efforts as it ties in well with our joint goals. This includes the creation of legitimate and trustworthy data system and legislation, supporting principles of open data and digital identity, and creating public and socioeconomic value, including through digital and digital financial inclusion. We've also worked with cloud services provider Amazon Web Services as our cloud technology partner. Thank you, AWS, for providing technical support. Thank you also to Cliff Decker Hofmeyr for their work on this paper. According to the data center market in the Africa Industry Outlook study, in Africa alone, the data center market by investment is expected to grow a compound annual growth rate of approximately 15% during the period 2020 to 2026. The same study states that the Africa data center market size by investment was valued at $2 billion in 2020 and is expected to increase to $5 billion by 2026. The increasing demand for cloud services and modular data center solutions among enterprises, especially in SMMEs and government agencies, is expected to drive the data market in Africa. It is expected that over 70% of organizations operating on the continent will shift to the cloud by by 2025. There are many benefits for this for SADC countries, as evidenced through the statistics I have just shared and as witnessed through our own practical experience. It is undeniable that there are clear benefits to digital and data-driven solutions. The innovation and technology which will assist the private sector in deploying these solutions sits with a handful of service providers, such as AWS, who, because of costs and other efficiencies, can, for the time being, only provide some of these technologies on a regional level. This means that the free flow of data across borders is essential in order to make use of these technologies. Although we are aware of the concerns around cross-border data transfers, it is important to consider that data processed across borders, including through cloud solutions, can bring more national businesses and consumers into the digital fold. Data technologies relying on cross-border data transfers can encourage the adoption of data-driven business strategies and thereby stimulate the economy. As highlighted by the OECD, cross-border data flows can increase economic efficiency and productivity, raising the welfare and standards of living. And, as correctly stated by the GSMA, the public sector also stands to benefit as government departments can also, through digital solutions, be allowed to deliver quality services at lower cost and pursue public policy objectives that might not otherwise be achievable. The benefits to consumers are many. Firstly, data flows and related cloud-hosted services support access to a wide range of goods and services which are available online. Secondly, data flows and related digital technologies allow businesses to respond to consumer demand by expanding more geographic markets in Africa. And thirdly, SMMEs will also benefit as the movement of data across borders will enable them to use common infrastructure to serve multiple markets and therefore spread their goods and services to customers more rapidly. As we move to unlock data technologies, technology players are planning various data-driven initiatives which focus on digital inclusion directly and which also make the lives of our customers easier. These initiatives also support government's digital and financial inclusion goals. It is therefore imperative to have enabling regulatory environments that allow for cross-border data transfers. The strategic role of the transfer of data across borders has been recognized by policymakers across the world. For example, the International Chamber of Commerce urges governments to ensure all citizens and companies can realize the full potential of the Internet by adopting policies that facilitate the adoption of new technologies in the global movement of data that supports them. An enabling regulatory environment regime will create a way for African states to participate more fully in the world's switch to a knowledge economy as both consumers and creators of knowledge-based products. It will allow for governments to play a positive role in reducing the uncertainty regarding the questions on privacy and security, and will encourage multi-stakeholder groups with the relevant expertise to continuously refine detailed, innovative solutions. We therefore ask that regulators and policymakers look towards facilitative regulation for data-driven technologies, including cross-border data transfers. As members of the private sector, and together with AUDA and NEPAD, we look forward to collaborating and sharing knowledge with you as we strive towards facilitative regulation for digital and data technologies. With the findings and recommendations provided in this paper, which we are launching today, we can all look forward to an exciting, digitally inclusive future. I now hand over to the team for a deeper discussion and trust that you will enjoy the engagement today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for so aptly setting the scene for us and reminding us and highlighting once again the importance of data flows, particularly when it comes towards boosting economic growth. We know how much our lives have changed, particularly over the past few years owing to the pandemic, and a lot more business and a lot more activity now moving online, further underscoring the importance of data flows and what it can do to benefit business and economic growth here on the continent. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that. As we've said earlier on, this is a partnership. So now we're also going to hear from the other collaborators here. We've heard about the benefits for economic growth, but obviously, digital platforms and digital capabilities are also critical for service delivery to the public. Just to remind you that today we're launching this paper in collaboration between AudoNEPAD and Vodacom, and that paper is entitled Enabling Policy Frameworks for Digital and Data Services for Expanded Economic Growth and Development, a focus on the SADC region. For more on that now, and the perspective of the public sector, we welcome, and to give us the keynote address, Mr. Martin Bwala. He's the Director of Knowledge Management and Program Evaluation at AudoNEPAD. Martin, welcome, and over to you.
Good day. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you at this important launch of the white paper on enabling digital and data services for expanded economic growth and development in Africa. As we've learned, the paper has been jointly developed between the African Union Development Agency and the Vodacom Group as part of our joint and mutual work stream in advancing emerging technologies in general and digitalization specifically in Africa. I'm making this statement on behalf of our CEO, who has followed this process keenly and very supportive, but has been unable to join us today. And I wish to also recognize all the people that are present here from the various institutions, interest groups, and stakeholders that we work with, both in the private sector, in the public sector, in civil society, also at member states in terms of government, as well as private sector. Let me start the statement by noting that private sector engagement is a key element in the African Union Development Agency delivery model. Agenda 2033 is clear and resolute on the principle that sustainable economic growth and inclusive development can only be realized through mutual public-private collaboration and shared responsibilities. It is perfectly possible to pursue business interests and development at the same time. It is not just a nice thing to do, but it's an essential element in the pursuit of sustainable and mutual success. So the African Union Development Agency and Vodacom Group partnership is a unique one in this regard, with the underlying goal to demonstrate results in the form of public goods and commercial value. Especially the African Union Development Agency and Vodacom Group partnerships has a focus on harnessing and fostering at-scale use of innovations that leverage emerging data, digital, and fourth industrial technologies to demonstrate clear and tangible value within national, regional, and continental economic growth and development efforts. The Vodacom Group has expanded global linkages to further enhance its outreach and operations to institutions in Africa towards building and scaling up the digital economy, building on Africa Union Development Agency's strength in science-based information and knowledge, research and development, and Africa's own intellectual assets, and Vodacom's technological capabilities. The partnership is opening new doors of opportunities for collaboration in the digital, cloud, and data service capabilities. It is in this context that one collaborative workstream has led to the development and publication of the white paper we are launching today. Allow me in this regard to highlight the following key points. The white paper is part of a broader collaboration between the African Union Development Agency and the Vodacom Group, aimed at strengthening the digital capabilities of African Union member states for enhanced public service delivery. The paper has come at an opportune time when the continent, recovering from the effects of COVID-19 and other global shocks, is putting in place increased efforts to accelerate the implementation of digitalization initiatives in both public service delivery and business. It is here important to recognize the place and the value of the white paper in the context of the digital transformation strategy adopted by the African Union in 2020, which underpins the critical role of data, science, and digitalization in the pursuit of Agenda 2033 goals and targets. African Union member states have not realized significant socioeconomic benefit of the digital economy due to a number of factors, including the usually not so supportive policy and regulatory framework, as well as slow pace of developing and enacting data protection laws in some cases. The added value of this white paper is in the provision of practical areas of consideration for African Union member states to ensure enabling regulatory environment for digital and data services, to facilitate appropriate free flow of data between jurisdictions for various regional digital economies. The enablement of easily facilitated cross-border data flows is the strong predictor for African Union member states to successfully compete in the global economy. It is envisaged that the practical recommendations and guidelines on digital regulatory reforms will stimulate appropriate political leadership response for member states in the continent, and in the interest of regional economic integration, reduce regulatory barriers in order to enact and create regional digital markets for the operationalization of the African Union Continental Free Trade Area. Wishing for a successful, and here I would like to especially emphasize the commitment of the African Union Development Agency in wishing for a very successful launch of this white paper, for GRENA to garner the necessary political support on accelerating implementation, including specifically aspects like the SADC model law on data protection and the African Union Digital Transformation Strategy and the data policy framework for viable and thriving digital economies. It is in our collective interest and commitment that this launch and the presentation of this paper to you will enable much more appropriate, relevant ability at all levels in terms of both the policy and investment choices we have to make in the pursuit of socioeconomic development, and especially more so in enabling both our small, medium enterprises, as well as public service delivery in critical areas of human development. I thank you.
Thank you so much there to Martin Bwala. He's the Acting Director of Knowledge Management and Program Evaluation at AUDA NEPAD, making some very important points. Just to that, I'd like to highlight that, as he said, that business and development can be done at the same time. There is not necessarily needs to be a contradiction. They can reinforce each other for the benefit broadly of society and for achieving the sustainable development goals. And most importantly, and I think aligned to our particular discussion today as we explore this particular paper, is that Africa is yet to take full advantage of the benefits of digital economies because the regulatory and legal framework has not stepped up to the plate sufficiently as yet. But how do we do that? That's what we're going to be exploring in some detail with more of our speakers. For more on this particular paper now, we're going to hear from Mosa Tekiso. Ms. Mosa Tekiso is the Executive Head of Digital and AI Regulation for Vodacom Group, and she's going to speak to some of the key highlights emanating from this policy paper and give us an executive overview as well. Hello, Musa, and welcome.
Thank you, Nikiwe, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm quickly going to take you through an executive summary of the paper. And I should say up front that the paper will be made available together with an AWS technology addendum for you all to look through and engage with. So in addition to the themes that Stephen and Martin touched on, what also motivated us to work on this paper is our own practical experience while rolling out our various data-driven products and services. And during our engagements with regulators, what we found is that our interests are actually aligned. And that gave us the basis for us working through the paper. The paper starts off by highlighting what the free flow of data means for a country that wants to participate meaningfully in a data economy. It then highlights that many companies providing digital and data services are relying more and more on remote technology, such as remote cloud and data services. So in order to make use of these technologies, data has to be able to move across borders. So then we looked at what a regulatory framework, which not only allows this, but supports it, would look like. And in doing so, we had to define the question. So we conducted a comprehensive analysis of the SADC countries. We looked at other jurisdictions in the EU. We looked at Singapore, Australia, etc. And the following regulatory environments, which are three, have been identified as being the main barriers for the free flow of data across international borders. The first that most of us have dealt with is data localization laws. The second is strict adequacy requirements, which we've seen through, for example, the EU's GDPR adequacy list. And the third is the inconsistent use of terminology, which means that when companies want to operate, they have to adapt to each country's set of terminology, rules, etc. And that can be seen directly in our own legislation here in South Africa, the POPI Act, which makes provision for business entities, whereas most data protection acts do not do that. So what we then did is once having identified these three barriers is we looked globally, continentally, regionally, and at country best practice to develop recommendations which we think could be applied here on the continent and specifically in the SADC region. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the best practice we picked up when developing the paper. In the EU, we looked at open data, we looked at the single market approach, and we also looked at Convention 108, which is a binding international instrument that protects individuals against abuses that may flow from the collection and processing of their data. There are currently only 55 parties who are signatories to Convention 108+, with only 4 falling outside of Europe, being Tunisia, Uruguay, Mauritius, and Senegal. From an Africa perspective, we also looked at the AU Digital Transformation Strategy and the Data Policy Framework. The Digital Transformation Strategy was adopted by the AU in 2020 with the goal to transform African societies and economies in a manner that allows the continent and its members to harness these digital technologies we've been referring to. And the objectives of the Digital Transformation Strategy is critical to the achievement of the AU's Agenda 2063. From a SADC perspective, the shining light is really Mauritius, and Mauritius has taken the most strides to ensure its participation in the global digital economy. It has a robust data protection law, which is enabling, and it's also a signatory to Convention 108+. We also looked at trade and trade arrangements, and what we saw is that preferential trade agreements and trade facilitation agreements really work in the absence of globally agreed upon norms regarding digital trade and cross-border data transfers. And the best example for the use of trade facilitation agreements is Singapore. Singapore and Australia entered into a digital economy agreement in August of 2020. And the provisions that are included in this agreement include provisions preventing unnecessary restrictions on the transfer and location of data, including financial sector data. Mauritius is really a great example of the use of trade agreements to facilitate digital economies. And, Singapore. And Singapore has not only signed this agreement with Australia, but it's also signed a similar agreement, a tripartite agreement, with Chile and also with New Zealand. And in addition to the provisions preventing the unnecessary restrictions on the transfer of data, each party in these agreements also has the responsibility to take into account the principles and guidelines relevant to international bodies such as the Asia Pacific Economic Region's cross-border privacy rule system. And there are numerous other examples of digital facilitation through international trade agreements. So what we can do as AU member states is we could utilize the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to develop rulemaking and regional cross-border data transfers, which are a centric approach, providing recognized certification mechanisms similar to what the Australia and Senegal and to what the Australia region has basically done. So having gone through developing and looking at international best practice, we then also looked at formulating the recommendations. And we've come up with a few recommendations which can be used from a SADC perspective. The first is regional cooperation via policies, which can be implemented in a sustainable, enforceable, and economically viable manner. And this, again, can be done through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The second option is regional cooperation via trade agreements. And this, again, goes back to the Australia-Singaporean approach under their digital economic agreement. And then lastly, we can also use AU preferential trade agreements to facilitate, as seen again in the Australian-Singaporean approach. The third option is regulatory reform. And the best way to do that is via the promulgation or the amendment of the laws accordingly. We've also made recommendations for other AU member states, and these essentially leverage off the SADC recommendations, which we've also included. And that again goes back to regulatory reform through establishing the relevant data protection agencies, through ratification of international conventions, and also harmonization and standardization, which we've already said is lacking. We've also included country-by-country recommendations, which obviously focus on the countries where we operate as Vodacom. So in a nutshell, that is essentially what the paper goes through. We've defined the three barriers. We've looked through best practice from all over the world, and then come up with recommendations that can be used at a SADC region, at an AU member state region, as well as at a country region where we do operate. So thank you, Nikiwe. That's all from my side. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you so much, Mosa. So lots to unpack, lots to think through in that policy paper. We're going to tease through those recommendations and findings with our panel. And certainly, if any questions are directed your way, we'll be sure to send them to you as well. Thank you so much. That is Mosa Tekiso. She is the executive head of digital and AI regulation for Vodacom Group. So lots to tease through as part of our discussion now. And we're going to enter into that roundtable dialogue. We have a number of speakers who will be joining us. But just a reminder, if you have any questions for our speakers who have already presented and for our speakers joining us now as part of our panel discussion, please do send them. There's a functionality that allows you to do so, and we'll try and put them to our speakers as soon as we are able. So thank you so much for that. Time now for me to introduce our speakers. We are joined by Ms. Abigail Yaboa. She is the head of administration at the Data Protection Commission in Ghana. We're also joined by Dr. Gideon Namaga, Head of Big Data and Innovations for Development at the African Union Development Agency, out of NEPAD, whom we've already heard from today. Our third guest today, hi there, is Clive Shelton. He is AWS Head of Solutions Architecture for Middle East and Africa. And my fourth panelist today, Mr. Matthew Allison, Senior Public Policy Manager at Vodafone Group, covering data, platforms, and artificial intelligence. Yesterday, please feel free to start sending them through. Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome. Abigail, I'll start with you. If you could give us a sense, if you will, how Ghana has begun to handle this as far as it pertains to an enabling regulatory framework.
Hello, good morning, and greetings from Accra, Ghana. Actually, the line was quite breaking, so if you could repeat the question, please.
Oh, no problem at all, Abigail. I said I would kick off with you because the scene has already been set by many of our speakers. We're looking at international best practice, how other jurisdictions have handled this. I wanted to know specifically from your end in Ghana, what approach is Ghana taking in terms of creating an enabling regulatory framework?
All right, good morning once again. Yes, in Ghana, we are fortunate to have the Data Protection Act, which was passed in 2012, and we had the Data Protection Commission, which was established in 2015. So currently, we have a supervisory authority that has been in operation since 2015. And a whole lot is going on in the Ghana ecosystem. Currently, what we realized in Ghana was there was a shortfall in skills. So the first thing that was first at the end of the day, when the act was created, in the act we said we should get the administrative measures that are necessary to ensure that data protection rules and regulation in Ghana the processing of data in Ghana is adequately maintained. So the task on the commission was to ensure that there's the creation of the skill set. That was when the data protection certificate practitioners training was established to be able to train practitioners across the country. So right now we have practitioners in the various public and private sectors who are able, in case of any issues, they are able to come to the commission and they are able to provide the needed guidelines. The commission is also working with the internal audit agency. You know that with data protection, the issues of compliance and data audit is quite necessary. So we are working with, there's an MOU with the internal audit agency where we ensure that all the internal auditors in the country are adequately trained in the full knowledge of data protection in that field so that they can do random audits in the various sectors of the economy. There is also the collaboration between the legal system. You know, definitely there should be enforcement, and we can conduct enforcement when the legal and the judiciary, they are fully aware of the mandate that is required by them in supporting the commission to effectively achieve its mandate. So when we come to the commission at that level, this is what is going on currently. And currently too, in the broader sense, you know, the public sector is the creator of large volumes of data, and we use large volumes of data. So there's currently the National Identification System, which is now in place to be able to synchronize all digital IDs in relation to the health insurance, in relation to revenue, in relation to taxation. That is the Ghana, the GRA, Ghana Revenue Authority, in relation to even SNIT, pensions and all that, and in relation to Controller and Accountant General, who process large volumes of public sector data. So there's this kind of harmonization between the various government departments and bringing on board the private sector, which we cannot do away with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail. Lots of food for thought in how Ghana has approached this. Matthew, let's bring you in here. I see the questions already coming in through thick and fast. What are the policy recommendations and guidelines to realize, well, that question has disappeared now, but that was a question. I don't know if you got a chance to see it and perhaps might have applied your mind to it. Oh, there we have it. It's back on screen again. What are the policy recommendations and guidelines to realize the operationalization of regulatory frameworks such as the SADC Model Law on Data Protection, the AU DTS, and DPF? That's a question coming from one of our participants.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the roundtable discussion. We've really followed the drafting and production of this report with great interest. And maybe before tackling the question specifically, I could just offer a few reactions, actually, if that would be okay. Because as you may know, in Vodafone Group, we've been very involved in policy development discussions around cross-border data flow globally. And within my function, we're responsible for advocating in different markets for solutions and frameworks which, in essence, try to facilitate cross-border data transfer as best we can. And for that reason, we think that the report is a really positive contribution to the discussion, and in particular, focusing on having an enabling regulatory framework for direct data transfer is something that we really support. And we think this is necessary to underpin the growth in digital services that, of course, we want to see across the continent, and ultimately acting as, if we can say, a bulwark or a defense against data localization being put forward as a solution in this particular sector, because as the report notes, this is ultimately not always a proportionate policy response. It's sometimes counterproductive, and we have the figures from the Leviathan Security Group that it can add as much as 60% in terms of storage costs for data. So this is not something that we advocate for. The report also does very well in looking at international best practice, and of course we have GDPR being one of the global benchmarks, but actually my personal reaction to this report is that it does very well in highlighting not only the strengths but also the weaknesses and potential drawbacks of GDPR and areas that it can and should be improved in the future, and looks at other models that we have, other regional models for data processing, for example, like the APEC cross-border privacy rules, and is mindful about the benefits and things that we could learn from those different regional examples as well. And then I think that brings us to the question that we have here in terms of practical recommendations on how to manage what are really inherent complexities in terms of transfer, storage, and processing of data globally to ensure that it can cross borders, but do so in a way that is trusted and has security, privacy, and confidentiality always baked in. And really, that will be, I think, what any kind of solution in this space will be built on. And the three things which come out of the report, the three sort of practical ways that you can achieve this that we would endorse, are firstly looking to align national data protection laws and to an extent try and standardize the way that data protection laws are drafted within a geographic area, within a region, and perhaps ultimately on a continent-wide basis, such that you have essential equivalence between those laws. And this is the legal language, the terminology which the EU uses in order to grant adequacy decisions, which will allow for fairly seamless cross-border transfer of personal data. And that point around equivalence, I think, is a really important one in this discussion. So we need to look at the emerging, the developing policy and regulatory frameworks that we have in different countries and in different markets, and to, where possible, align them so that the controls that are in place, the legal basis that exist, the purposes, the justifications, the controls around data processing, even the definitions and terminologies of what constitutes a data processor, a data controller, a data subject, etc., are aligned to the extent possible. And once you have that, you have the basis for a regional cross-border data transfer solution. And then the next level above this is looking at the role of regional and international trade agreements to facilitate some of that harmonization. And of course, the report mentions a number of different sort of Pan-African or continental trade agreements that we can look to. And of course, there is a lot actually within the APEC system here that we have with the common, the cross-border privacy rules that we can look to maybe have draw some inspiration here. Of course, from the EU perspective, there is a long history and a long discussion of negotiating cross-border data transfer alongside trade agreements, but there has always been actually quite a political tension within the Commission to ensure that actually sort of data protection is regarded and treated as a fundamental right and not something that could be traded or bartered away within trade agreements. So the two things tend to happen in parallel rather than being bundled within a trade agreement. But no, we think that that is absolutely an example that we can draw on and look to. So no, thank you for the opportunity to participate in the discussion. I also prepared a few reactions looking at the situation in Europe as it's developing, the policy discussions that we're having around data sovereignty, which is, I think, parallel to some of the recommendations that we have in this report, and happy to elaborate on those if time allows.
Absolutely. We will return to that matter and touch on it. Let's just give our other speakers an opportunity to also begin to make their opening remarks. Gideon, let's bring you into the discussion. What are, in your view, some of the socio-economic benefits of the appropriate is an important emphasis here, appropriate free flow of data among jurisdiction? And before you respond, Gideon, just to remind our participants that we welcome their participation and to please send through their comments and questions. Any members of the media as well also joining us are welcome to do so as well. Gideon?
Thank you very much, moderator, for this session. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Correct. So let me give a little bit of context. The idea of cross border transfer of data is quite keen for socioeconomic development. If you look at the recent COVID-19 pandemic and the notion that disease have no boundaries, clearly, if you want to monitor surveillance of epidemics across borders, you need such kind of regulatory environment to be able to do that. And if you look at the health issues, it has implications on the well-being of citizenry. So that is quite key. The other element is about trade, and I think it's been alluded by Matthew and other colleagues. For instance, if a cotton grower in Dakar wants to access the textile market in Addis Ababa, these are cross-border trade issues, and beneath that, whilst the CFTA agreement deals with tariff and rules of origin, underneath that you need underlining subsidiary policy framework that supports such trade flows. And cross-border regulatory system is one key examples of them. The issue of trade, health, and other socioeconomic dimensions all are underpinned by use of data and digital tools. One of the issues that we have on the continent is the slow pace of the adoption of some of these standards and regulations. So to be able to achieve that, you need actually acceleration of enactions and adoption of these international standards. Moderator, these are some few pointers that I want to allude to in terms of what we can benefit from cross-border data flow. The whole idea of the Continental Free Trade Area and other policies for the continent is integration. We having one economic community where people can move across border, but as well as transactional issues such as trade, data, information across border that supports economic activity. So these are some of the very beneficiation that we can get if we have harmonizations of our policies as well as standardization across our member states. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Gideon, for highlighting what some of the benefits can be. And yet, of course, at the end of the day, there is the real concern about security and the fact that people may have a lack of trust in the security of the cloud, for example, or data flows and transfers across jurisdictions. Let's bring you in here, Clive, and speak to some of those concerns. How do we counter or begin to make people feel at ease about the issue of security and their data?
Thank you very much, Nikiwe, and thank you first of all for allowing us to participate in the panel as well. Yes, so security is of course one of the primary concerns in this entire discussion, and in fact it's what we refer to as job zero at AWS. It's critically important for us as an organization to ensure that our customers' workloads and data is secured at all times. We have extensive infrastructure around the world with 26 geographic regions and a further 8 announced local zones announced in Africa, in South Africa and Kenya, and outposts as well. The importance is for customers in this conversation to understand that any data traversing our network backbone is encrypted by default. So this gives them the security and assurance that they can meet the data control requirements and frameworks like GDPR and POPIA. But it's also important to understand that we operate in a shared responsibility model. And what that means is AWS operates and manages and controls the layers of IT components from our host operating system down through the virtualization to the physical security, while customers are responsible for everything above that. So the operating systems of the virtual machines and those kind of controls. Also important to note is that when customers are talking about data residency or locality in AWS, customers are always in full control of their own data. So they choose where that data will reside, and it'll never move unless they choose to move it for any reason. And then of course, they have the full control and availability of our security services. We have over 20 dedicated security services to help customers secure their services, from key management services to identity and access management, and multiple database options for storing their data securely at any point. And I'd love to go into more, but we're also conscious of time, so I'll allow the other panelists to respond as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Clive. That's actually very useful and informative. So in terms of paving the way forward now and looking at a regional wide approach, how can, Abigail, I'll pose this to you as well, and I think Musa, I'll bring you in as well. How, in your view, can AU member states start to accelerate implementation of the principles of this regional integration framework as it pertains to regulatory barriers, economies of scale, etc.?
Hi, yeah. To my understanding, is a step in the right direction, whereby there is this harmonized laws by the African Union that is now underway, and we are the various stage of looking at how they can integrate it into the sectors of the African member states. So African member states, at the end of the end of the day, we should look at getting one harmonized laws. One critical issue that that can come off head is this gray area that we find in our Data Protection Act when it comes to cross-border data flow. Yes, the Act is quite very silent on it. It really doesn't give the direction as to this is it, and this is the direction that we are supposed to go when it comes to cross-border data flow. So with this harmonized rules that is coming into play by the African Union, is a step in the right direction. And we when we were put on the spotlight to indicate and to when we were on the when we were put on the spotlight by the African Union, when we were used as a case study nation during the development of those harmonized rules, we got 1 out of 5, and right now it's led us to force and ask for amendment with the government, so that government can put in policies in place to amend that aspect of the law, and to help us to also be at par with other stakeholders in the economy. So this principle is unique, and it's not only helping Ghana, because even with our issue having that gray area in our act, we are still benchmarked by other African states. So with these harmonized laws in place, it's going to accelerate in the implementation of the data protection principles, the principle of accountability, the principles of openness, transparency, which is very key in governance and in the data system, is really going to help in the implementation of those principles in the African member states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail. Now, obviously, Musa, as part of this policy paper, this is something you would obviously have made in your recommendations and findings. Could you expand on that as well?
Yeah, absolutely, Nikiwe. And I think what we've also spoken about is that there are model laws, policies, etc., that we could all participate in as member states. For example, the AU Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection. That's an existing standard policy, etc. But we only have 12 member states that have signed or ratified it so far. So if other member states could also start to participate, on a regional level through signing up to those kind of conventions, standards, etc., it would really take us a long way in bridging that gap and in really catapulting us into robust digital frameworks. But we are seeing, a willingness to share knowledge, a willingness to engage, a willingness to understand the technology, to deal with the security concerns, asking why is for example, the technology only in South Africa, not other parts of Africa. So we are engaging, the questions are there, and we're always willing to really unpack them. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much, Musa. And I think we seem to be coming back to a similar theme of questions, and these are just some of the questions coming through from the participants today. Matt, I think I'll put this to you, even though I think Clive to some extent did touch on some of the security concerns. The question is, how can we demystify the fears that regulators have around cross-border data flows related to sovereignty, privacy, national security, and enforcement? And of course, this gives you an opportunity to respond and expand on something you wanted to speak about earlier on data sovereignty.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting question. And I like the term actually, to demystify, because perhaps a lot of the concerns that exist in this space about using cloud solutions and leveraging the sort of the economies of scale that come from cloud and data processing solutions do stem from, perhaps a level of mystique about what the cloud is, where your data is stored. And I think the way we go about demystifying that is exactly what Clive said, which is reassuring, and this is a job for companies as much as it is for governments, reassuring customers that they have best-in-class security available to them. I like the term that sort of security is always job number one. And then where possible, actually demonstrating that to them. And this is where the role of things like certification schemes come in, right? And there's a big discussion at the moment in Europe about a new certification scheme for cloud services to demonstrate they meet the necessary cybersecurity requirements that ENISA is working on. That's a very live debate, and there are some of the requirements in there that we have a few views about that I can elaborate on. But as a general principle, the notion that you would have a scheme, an accreditation, a trust mark, something that you can offer to customers to say, we have met requirement X, Y, and Z. That is an independently audited, reviewed process. It is something which I think really will offer a lot of comfort to customers, and that will maybe get around that kind of the mystery. And we're on a journey here. You move away from having all of your data on-prem in a sort of, in a locker that you can access, to having it then stored digitally, and finally to having it stored in the cloud. That's a journey that you need to take customers and governments on with you. And as I say, that's, I think, really incumbent on companies in order to do that. And then, just mentioning the ENISA scheme, I think is quite a good segue into some of the work that we're doing on at the moment, which is on data policy, moving actually beyond discussions around data localization, which have been very active and very hard fought in Europe over the past 5-10 years, to a discussion around data sovereignty, which is, I think, a parallel concern, and really does link into some of the concerns, the mystique around where data is transferred and is stored, but crucially is not just linked to personal data. I think a lot of the discussions that we've had in the past around localization do relate to, ensuring that personal data protection rights can be upheld. And it's looking more at the value, the economic and societal value of data in the round, including non-personal data, maybe sensitive industrial data. And European policymakers are looking at this and feeding that into the wider objective they have to ensure Europe's resilience and strategic autonomy in what is increasingly a more sort of hostile global sort of trading and security environment. But the consequence is that we're having to contend with some policy requirements to achieve sovereignty, which in our view are disproportionate and could actually be counterproductive, because they're requiring not only that companies would take necessary security operational steps to ensure that data is stored and processed privately and securely, but also including some what we would call sort of political or geopolitical considerations around, for example, the corporate headquarters, the shareholding, the structure of a company, which are not founded in security best practice and would result in closing off the European market to a number of international providers in a way which we think, as I say, would actually be counterproductive. So that's where the discussion is at the moment. And we've actually partnered with Capgemini to produce a report on cloud edge sovereignty. So looking at this theme of digital sovereignty and data sovereignty in the context of both cloud, but also edge technology solutions. And we include a number of recommendations, which I think are also relevant to this debate, pointing at the need to ensure a harmonized approach across the single market, but also highlighting the advantage that you have from an open strategic sovereignty approach in terms of cloud adoption and impact on European GDP. And our message throughout that report is always that we should regulate service providers. We should leverage the strength that we have in terms of regulatory power in Europe. We should use certification to do that demystification and offer customers the security sort of comfort that they need. And in doing so, you actually allow the market to stay open, and you don't need to exclude service providers based on things like, say, headquarters, shareholding, etc. So, hopefully that's just a flavour of some of the recommendations that we've come across, and happy to share that report as well in background to anyone who's interested to see those findings.
Thanks so much, Matt, for sharing those insights. So those questions coming through thick and fast from our participants. If we could see the next question coming through. There are a number of questions directed, I think one of them to you specifically, Clive. There's a concern of loss of jobs when data is transferred outside a specific country. What is your comment on this?
I'm not sure that that's something that we see. I mean, with the transfer of data, across borders and that kind of thing. There is still a requirement on the data owners and the data processors to be implementing the correct controls to protect that data. With cloud computing, access to the data and the services was all internet-based. So the location of the data, I don't think impacts the people that are working on the data, as long as you have the internet access to do so. You know, I wanted to draw in an example of probably slightly linked to what Matt was talking about now as well, of the South African Reserve Bank and the Prudential Authority, who've created a framework for FSIs to permit the use of cloud services and offshoring regulated data. But they've taken a risk-based approach where the data owners and data processors need to implement the correct controls to mitigate the risk of the data. You know, applying to banks in South Africa, but also operating across the African region. So it probably links in the two of those, both from the regulatory point of view and also processing the data out of country.
Thanks, Clive. Another question coming in. It looks like the approach to legislating data is predominantly securocratic, protectionist, and sovereign in nature. Why is it that AU member states don't seem to appreciate the economic benefits of data and data flows? Gideon, would you like to take a stab at that particular question?
Yes, I was actually wanting to come in to collaborate the comment that Clive and Matthew made. So there are three things here. The first is that we actually need to close the gap, the knowledge gap between data systems, right? the sciences of data systems and policymakers. There's a huge gap, right? So when you talk about platform as a service and software as a service, policymakers don't understand some of these terminologies. So there is a need to close that gap. You can talk about all the benefit that comes with cross-border data flow, but if they don't understand it, right, then you have a problem because they are the policymakers. So that gap needs to be closed. And at AUD, we have a program that is geared towards that. The second is predominantly the history we have on our continent. If you look at issues of colonization, there's a little bit of trust issue when the data set that reside, citizenry data sets on the continent has to reside in another jurisdiction outside of the continent. So the solution here is to change the hearts and minds of policymakers to be able to understand. And that is not technical. That are soft issues. These are soft issues and soft skills that you need to be able to do that. The third is we need to really demonstrate in practical terms the socioeconomic impact or beneficiation that the countries as a policymaker will see clearly in the implementation of such systems. So if you combine all these three together, then you are looking at really an issue of knowledge gap that needs to be closed. Lastly, maybe before I leave the floor, is that the issue of job loss actually is the opposite, as Clive was alluding to. If you look at how many data centers do we have for AWS on the continent, I think if you talk of South Africa, that's the only one. And we need to actually move the policymakers to a point where they understand that unless you have good regulatory system, an enabling regulatory system, no firm will want to establish a data center in your jurisdiction. And once that is established, a data center is established within your jurisdiction, this comes with tech transfer. And it comes with a lot of the issues in terms of IPs, the skills that is needed to manage these data centers. So, moderator, these are the few things that I want to allude to in terms of the perception that we have, mainly due to our history. And then thirdly, we need to close the knowledge gap. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely important points that you're raising there, Gideon. And I think that this brings us, I think, to the nub of our discussion, because it's all well and good, I think, to draft a policy paper which seeks to highlight what the key issues are and make recommendations. The fact of the matter is that issues around technology remain full of jargon and are not easy to reach or understand for everyone broadly, let alone policymakers as well. Musa, if you could come in here, how do we take a policy paper, policy position such as this, and simplify it, to use a word used earlier, demystify it, so that the knowledge contained in it is accessible and implementable, not just for policymakers, but understandable by all, so that we know why it is that there are these socioeconomic benefits. If it becomes too jargonistic and too technical, we simply can't reach it.
Yeah, Nikki, it is a tricky one because the subject matter does tend to get a bit complicated. However, I think we use it as a practical tool. From a private sector perspective, sometimes we tend to speak in a very jargonistic way, using terminology that just isn't easy to follow. So what we do is we engage with it in a simplified manner. We make it easy to follow, we share knowledge, and also we become less insular with this knowledge. And by that, I mean that we share knowledge within jurisdictions as well. We open up in terms of industry as well. We share knowledge, and we continue to engage with it. So what we don't want is for this paper to just sit on the shelf and look pretty on our website. We want people to engage with it and actually use it as a tool, which is why we've made clear recommendations at regional level, which can be applied, on the continent generally, as well as specific recommendations that we've made for countries where we do engage on a regular basis. So that is what we want. It's a tool that we can use towards taking the steps in the right direction.
Thanks so much, Musa. Abigail, let's bring you in here. We've spoken about creating an enabling environment and having the requisite regulatory environment and framework. But often what we find as a challenge, I think, and across various jurisdictions and even regionally as well, is ensuring that there is an implementation of these laws, an implementation of recommendations. How do we ensure that that is in fact effected and speeded up?
Yeah, I couldn't agree less with Musa. The issue is right now we have this beautiful paper that has been created, and it's not going to be the first or the last kind of paper that will be created concerning data or concerning regulations or concerning cross-border data flows. We should look at it from, I wouldn't look at it from the broader perspective as to the continental level. We can achieve a broader continental leverage when we are able to achieve it in our own backyards. That is, we are able to domesticate this policy into our own national setting. Because if a country in the AU member state or a country in the SADC is able to put up mechanisms in place, able to empower its data protection supervisory authority, or if there is no authority that has been, there is no data protection laws and its accompanying data protection supervisory authority, they establish their laws, they get the authority in place, an independent authority with the right funding, with the right resources, with the right capacity building, so that we can domesticate these policies at our own level, sensitization of the citizenry. Whilst Dr. Nimaku was speaking, he made mention of policymakers not being able to even align with the issue of data policies and data regulations. So this is the time where we should be able, the policy has been beautifully crafted, but we should be able to segment it in our local system to be able to understand it, to be able to sensitize them, to be able to sensitize our citizens, to be able to bring out all the gray areas and the gray points, which needs effective monitoring and effective evaluations. And at the end of the day, if at our own national levels we are able to get it right, then it can help in the broader picture at the continental level. That is where we can provide the platform where other nationalities can also come and learn from it. It should be tailored down to our cultural and socio-cultural levels so that other African member states could also learn from it. And at the end of the day, there will be that common platform where we can share knowledge and share skills. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Abigail. And in keeping with that ethos of ensuring that this information and this policy paper is socialized, we've just posted it on the link so people can engage with it meaningfully and understand what some of its recommendations are going forward. So let's look ahead now in terms of next steps. Matt, I'll start with you. Ultimately, what would we like, or do we envisage seeing happening, particularly as it pertains to various jurisdictions here on the continent, to ensure that there are, of course, data flows which benefit everyone, but of course those concerns that people have are allayed and that governments are supported to the extent that it's necessary in ensuring that regulatory framework?
Thank you. I'll be very brief in summing up, and maybe I've touched on a few of these points before. But firstly, recognition of the importance of cross-border data flow in enabling digital innovation and the spread of digital products and services, and that can be written into policy documents. It can be reflected in the approach to procurement that governments take. And that needs to be backed up by proportionate, robust, and well thought out model data protection rules that have the individual at the centre, but also allow for, as I say, proportionate and reasonable use of data for different purposes. And then the last piece is the international kind of perspective, and I think we touched on a few of the points there around aligning of data protection laws and standardisation of the terminology that is used therein. And then increasingly looking towards international agreements. They can be bilateral, they can be multilateral, and they can be based on trade, but also on negotiation between parties that will facilitate data transfer in a way which, again, has that trust, that security flowing with the data as it crosses borders. So I think those are the main ones from our perspective. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt. And Abigail, I'm going to hand over to you to make your concluding comments. But as you do so, if you could speak to this particular question, which has also been posed for you, what can we say is the specific role of regulators and data protection commission bodies where cross-border data transfer is concerned in reconciliation with the allowable activities in legislation?
Wow, thank you very much. The Data Protection Commission or Data Protection Authorities, when I'm talking, I want to always narrow it down to what is actually happening here in Ghana. So I first highlighted that we have been able to identify the gray area when it comes to cross-border data flow. So at the commission level, we have the Act, and the section 3 of the Act says that the commission puts up the administrative measures to ensure that we are relevant in the ecosystem. So looking at this kind of gray area in our jurisdiction, in our Act, what the commission did is to ensure that there is a data protection impact assessment, which if there is supposed to be any cross-border data transfer, we at the commission level, we analyze it and we review it, we give the recommendations, and before we give you that permission to transfer that data, which is quite time consuming, which is quite it's time consuming, and it doesn't even help in efficient service delivery. That is why we are actually pushing for an amendment of this type of issue that we have in the Act. So, reconciling our activities in legislation and what is actually in the Act, that is what we are currently doing over here. And we are trying to ensure that there is a trustworthy data system in the country. The issue goes down with trust, and you can only gain the trust of the citizenry when there is transparency. So right now we are working towards transparency. We are working towards building the trust of the people, and at the end of the day, bringing the total transformation in the data protection ecosystem in the country and even across. So that's what we are currently doing, working on the activities in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail. And unfortunately, we're really battling to hear your response. Hopefully, we'll have another opportunity before we conclude to try and come back to you. If you could summarize that quite succinctly. I think the connection was a little unstable there for us. But let's hand over now to Clive to make his concluding remarks. Clive?
Thank you, Nikiwe. So I think to conclude, I just wanted to maybe link up with something that Gideon mentioned in his last remarks, which was around governments and regulators opening policies to allow the safe cross-border data transfer. It kind of enables and generates a flywheel. It encourages organizations to start investing in skills transfer, investing in infrastructure, and it just accelerates the economy, across the continent. And I think also I'd like to just wrap up with mentioning that we have public policy teams in AWS that work with regulators and governments to try and educate them and assist them in understanding the services that we have and the security controls that we have to allow them to create the policies that will work across continents. So we'd be absolutely happy to work with regulators across the continent and to try and encourage the kinds of policies that will allow and encourage this kind of data control for the benefit of everyone.
Thank you so much, Clive, and that's very helpful as well. Gideon, your perspective from outer NEPAD, your concluding remarks?
Yes, one, we need to really increase the collaboration between private and public sector. We always talk about these PPPs, and most of the time it's mostly rhetoric. So we need to move into action and tighten the collaboration between the public policymakers and the private sector. And it should be a win-win situation on both ends, as Martin alluded to. Secondly, there should be dedicated programs to enhance the knowledge sharing and close the knowledge gap that I alluded to, what we call socialization. You need dedicated programs to be able to do that. You cannot leave it fallow. You need support programs to be able to do that. And then lastly, a paper like this or any policy framework, you need key policy makers. Let me tell you something. Policymakers' attenuation level is very low. A 36-page policy document, they aren't going to read it. So you need key, straightforward messages that hit home for them to be able to consider when designing policy. So these are my 3 concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Gideon, thank you. Short and sharp and very clear. Musa, we will give you a chance to summarize and conclude for us? And also, if you could speak to, by way of response into how do we adequately socialize this kind of knowledge in order to close the gap which has been highlighted here. And just to remind our participants that the paper has been posted on the chat box. So at the end of the particular session, you can just refresh your browser to access that particular policy paper. So there'll be plenty of other opportunities to engage on its recommendations and findings further. Musa, I will give you the last word. You're muted, Musa. We really want to hear from you. So unmute yourself and go.
Apologies. So my final remarks basically tie into what Gideon has just said, and this is why this collaboration was so important to us, because we understood the socialization aspect very well. So therefore, we look forward to collaborating even further to socialize it at more local level as we give it life and give it legs. So we still continue to engage as we roll out products and services. So that hasn't stopped from an operational perspective, but also bearing in mind that we need to actually push for laws to create these enabling environments. So for us, it's kind of a dual strategy, but definitely we're implementing it. Socialization is a big part of it, and we'll be moving forward with Gideon and the team as well.
So thanks so much for that. You've summarized everything aptly for us, and we look forward to how then this becomes something that is more easily defined and refined and easier to understand and engage with, and to see progress in terms of implementation. Ultimately, because as we said at the beginning of this segment, is that we want to see the benefits of digital innovation and digital economy so that the majority in Africa begins to benefit, whether it's small businesses or whether it's enhancing the service delivery. So let's look at what the possible solutions are in boosting economic growth, in ensuring that we achieve our sustainable development goals for the continent as well. Thank you so much to all of our participants. Matthew Allison, Senior Public Policy Manager at Vodafone Group, Clive Shelton, AWS Head of Solution Architecture for the Middle East and Africa, Dr. Gideon Namago, Head of Big Data and Innovations for Outer NEPAD, also joined by Abigail Yaboa, Head of Administration at the Data Protection Commission in Ghana. We really appreciate your time and your inputs and your insights today on the occasion of the launch of this very, very important policy document. Just to summarize for you, it's called Enabling Policy Frameworks for Digital and Data Services for Expanded Economic Growth and Development, a focus on the SADC region. We've shared it with you. Feel free, of course, to reach out to all the teams should you have or require further information about it. That's it from me. Thank you so much for joining us. We've all learned a great deal, I'm sure, from all of our speakers today. Take care.